Hello, my name's Tim Pine. I'm from Footprint in Brighton. We set Footprint up because there is a massive interest and need for the construction industry to reduce the amount of carbon that it's producing. It's about 35% of what the UK is kicking out at the moment. So what we've done is we've decided to put in contact the people who've got a need or an interest or an requirement in reducing carbon with the people who've potentially got the solutions for how they might go about it. Before the show, we've set up some talks called table talks because we're sitting around a table. And I think this will start the conversation going. This morning, I've got Andrew Waugh, who's a director of Waugh Thistleton Architects and has been building or designing timber buildings for at least 15 years to my knowledge. And Francis Hilton, who's a very established developer who runs a company called Pelican Developments. Now, Andrew, to start the ball rolling, why build in wood?
We have been designing and building, researching, drawing in wood, in timber, as you said, for a long time now. And that is in order to find a viable alternative to concrete and steel. So the production of concrete and steel are massive emitters of carbon. And so what we need to be doing is thinking about if we need to build more buildings, which we do, then how can we build those buildings without exacerbating the problems we have around climate change, without emitting more carbon into the atmosphere?
Francis, you two, I know you've had a meeting a few months ago, didn't you, about exactly this. And one of the things that you brought up was the regulatory problems of building in timber. Is that something that's an issue?
Yeah, it is an issue. There's no question about that. And obviously one automatically refers back to the dreadful things that happened at Grenfell a few years ago and all those issues that sit around that. Timber is, from my knowledge, has inherent fire qualities in terms of you can char a timber beam and it will still carry a structural load and everything else. But quite rightly, the fire brigade and people like that are very concerned about, well, what happens if a fire does break out? How does it spread through a building? So you've got a massive health and safety issue that we need to understand and how that works. And also the other interesting thing from my point of view is the supply and the demand of it. Where does the timber come from? Is it certified sustainable? And how can all these things be dealt with? So the regulatory is not just about fire health and safety, but it's also about, is the material truly sustainable? How many trees do we need within a building? What are all the issues with regard to the structural integrity of these buildings? Because we knew the Victorians built in timber and they did it very, very successfully. And how has that can then be moved forward? And the only thing that constrained the Victorians was how you move people through a building, the lifting. We've got over that through lifts, so we can actually build very tall buildings. And can we do that within timber? So within my comment, there's a whole layering of different questions that, Andrew, over to you to try and deal with.
Okay, well, the first question about the regulation issues, and you're absolutely right. The situation has changed since the tragedy at Grenfell. Prior to that, we'd built, around 25 CLT buildings in the UK, and fire safety is an incredibly important part of the design process, and so something we've always taken incredibly seriously. But the unfortunate kind of thing for timber around the changes in regulations since Grenfell, I think is kind of collateral damage for, as far as the government are concerned for timber, and which is really unfortunate. I don't think it will, I don't think these regulatory issues will be around for long, because I think they're largely mistaken, and and they will be disproven. The rest of the world, literally the rest of the world, are changing their building regulations to encourage the use of timber. We're alone in the UK in restricting its use. I mean, we are looking at how we can work around that, and we are also working with lots of different research institutes in the UK and further afield, looking at the research that's being done, what research needs to be done, etc. So these are things that we will overcome. It's frustrating at the moment, but we will overcome those. In terms of sustainability, the timber that we use, all the timber that we use, is either PEFC or FSC certified. So that means that the sustainably managed forests that those trees come from, and this is a crop. We're not kind of like, we're not kicking out the wildlife and ripping down trees randomly. These are sustainably managed crops of trees grown specifically for, for use. And those are all certified, so every time one of those trees is cut down, it's cut down to sort of, a metre above the ground, and 5 more are planted back in its place. And as for the supply, we've done a couple of research projects through the US Department of Agriculture looking at that supply, both in a North American, European context, but also in a global context. And there are a lot of trees, out there. We need to plant more trees, for sure. Well, the whole world needs to plant more trees. But there are a lot of trees out there. You need about 3 trees per person in a building. So it's not a massive amount. And every building that we have built in timber, we've used less timber in that building, less timber to build that building than we have in the one before. So the advances in engineering, in understanding the capacity of the material, is something that I think will reduce further and further the amount of timber that we actually need for these structures.
Francis, when you say the problem is legislation, is it the fact that you can't get funding for it, you can't get insurance for it, you're not allowed to build it, or you've got a feeling that people might not want to live in it?
I think it's a combination of all those points you've raised. I think we're certainly finding the funding market, and I'm currently running a project at the moment where we're talking to the big institutions and the big funds. And the first thing almost on their agenda is, what are your sustainability credentials? What are the ESG issues? How far are you buying into those? Are you developing at a zero carbon level? And if you're not, why not? And you better have some very good answers. And certainly timber is one of those materials that is the obvious choice in terms of, from a structural point of view, and the ability to be able to either have as a primary or a secondary means of construction. Secondary, I mean, in conjunction with a steel frame, and looking at having timber floors rather than steel floors with or trays with concrete on them. So there's a whole variety of issues in there. But if you're building a high-rise building of, shall we say, 70 or 80 metres, which is the one I'm referring to at the moment down in Southwark, you have a whole raft of issues that you need to address. And the funders are looking at your ESG credentials, your sustainability credentials, and timber is obviously one of those tools that you can actually use. Also, developers moved a long way from, we need to do that in order to hit regulation. Actually, developers want to build sustainable buildings. They want to address the sustainability issue and the carbon issue.
The other thing I was interested in was that obviously in the old days when people used to buy their own building, they were terribly concerned about whether they'd be able to sell it on. But now we're moving very much to the point where people are increasingly renting places, and therefore they're less obsessed by the selling on value of it. And it seems to me that they're more interested in actually the carbon footprint of the building. A bit like they're interested in the carbon footprint of the furniture that they're buying or the car that they're driving around in. And therefore that's changing, I think, the marketplace quite considerably. So really, in a sense, it's falling down to the developers to make the decision rather than their marketplace.
You as a developer are no longer looking at, for example, your tenant now will most likely come to work on a bicycle or come on the transport. They're not interested in parking cars. 10, 15 years ago, it would be the car parking ratio. Today, it's now the bicycle parking ratio. And those numbers, quite rightly, are actually increasing. And your modern chief executive of a highly successful business is going to be looking to park his £10,000 carbon fibre bicycle. And where can he have a shower? And how can he retain staff? 5% of costs are probably attributed towards the physical building. 80% of the company's costs are primarily in their staff. So again, it moves into this whole area of wellness, environment, sustainability, and all those things are critical. And if I'm building a building, the first place I want to know is 3 years down the line is who's going to take my building, regardless of whether it's sale, leasing, tenants, whatever it might be. Who is going to actually occupy my building?
And also in 10 years' time, what is the value of that building going to be? Because if the volume of the conversation is like this now, imagine where we're going to be in 10 years' time.
Yeah, of course. So really, it seems to boil down to the legislation and regulation being the sole problem, because you seem to want to do it. Andrew's got the solutions for how you do it. The only thing seems to be the fact that you're being stopped doing it?
I wouldn't say we're being stopped. I think, government, local authority, everybody wants to do it, but there isn't a sort of a clear route map. And you've got building control and district surveyors who are coming to sign these buildings off. And in certain instances, they may even be personally liable for signing these buildings off. They are going to want to know that if you are living in this building, let's call it living, doesn't matter whether you're an office person or a person sleeping there, it doesn't really matter. If you're living and using this building, are they safe? And if, God forbid, there is a problem, are they still safe? It's all very well designing a building, but the issue about fire is not necessarily about the fire, it's the structural integrity of the building. What happens when those materials are heated up to high temperature and burn? I bought a Victorian warehouse about 10, 15 years ago, and after we'd done the soft strip, it was apparent there'd been a fire in there. Well, that fire took place in 1945. We got the structural engineers in who looked at the 8 beams and said they're fine. Structurally, they were absolutely fine. But they were charred to bits, and it's right the way through the building, 6-storey building in Manchester. And so it's about having the ability for the government or the local authority who's signing that building off to say, we're satisfied it's safe. And that comes down to you as designers and architects, suppliers of materials and developers. We're all willing to do it. And I think what Footprint aims to do is actually get that conversation going at a level that's practical. And this cuts across not only about timber, but it cuts across all elements of sustainability. It may make sense to use electricity, but actually, does it make sense? Is there a practical is there a practical way of doing it? And is there a better way of doing it? Heat and ventilation systems. We've got used to the old fan coil network and air conditioning systems, but actually modern technologies and modern computer programs allow that to become far more efficient using less energy. And we need a system that once this building's been built, that actually those tenants or those occupiers or those people living in the building use it correctly to make sure that we're reaching those sustainable credentials and those environmental credentials, and frankly, driving out the use of carbon in all aspects of our life.
So something else I think is really important to mention is that, this is new, this is brand new, a brand new way of building. I mean, when you were, if you were to commission us to do a concrete and steel building, then that's something that we all have masses of experience in doing, and we can present you with that. The process is understood. But building a timber building, for many of us, and for every timber building that's being built, so many of those decisions will be being made for the first time. So it needs to be a truly collaborative process. So the architect, the engineer, the fire engineer, the building surveyor, the cost consultant, all of those people need to be working together in order to kind of drive the best result. And I think that collaboration of effort is what's going to make a success of these buildings and what will help us to progress through the kind of issues that we have at the moment.
Interesting. And in terms of things like cost and other bits and pieces, if you take that fundamental decision at day one to actually go, as you described, the collaborative route and build a timber building or build using materials that are predominantly carbon-free or reduce carbon, is there any increase in cost?
There shouldn't be. I really don't believe there shouldn't be. Of the projects that we've built, we've had to demonstrate cost efficiency and program efficiency on every single one of them.
So it's rather like the BREEAM standard that buildings or offices are built to, that actually if you make that decision to go into, we're going to build an outstanding building, the reality is if you start at day one and you plan your building with all those things in mind, actually there's very little cost increase.
I don't think there should be any cost increase. In fact, I think that the cost efficiencies from program, from everything else, should actually end up with a kind of more efficient, less expensive building. And I think that it's about resource conscious design. So thinking about how you design a building and the use of resources in the construction of that building, and those being kind of like concurrent sort of like processes that you're working on.
And it's also the ability to take weight out of a building, which actually then is the knock-on effect of the less need to have large pilings, less need to have large foundation works, the less time in the ground, the less invasive work, the whole issues that spin off that.
Yeah, I mean, our timber buildings, the structure of those buildings is 20% the equivalent structure, 20% of the weight of the equivalent structure in concrete. Yeah. So these are really light buildings. In fact, the problems that you have building it tall are not about the gravitational load. They literally are about the wind load because the buildings are so light.
How interesting. So actually you're then into anchoring and how you actually secure the building to the ground rather than actually keep it out of the ground.
Yeah, absolutely.
Fascinating. Fascinating.
Andrew and Francis, thank you very much. We're very much looking forward to having our event down in Brighton, when you can walk in and hear probably about 1,000 of these sorts of conversations going on, hopefully with the odd glass of wine. This is Table Talks. Thank you very much.